Brothers and sisters, theys and them, all you citizens of the world. I'm Michael James, co-founder of Rising Up Angry, and I'm here with my compadre Peter Kuttner, and we are members of Rising Up Angry. And as some of you know, there's a brand new Rising Up Angry alum site on YouTube, and we're going to add some more interviews with fellow members of Rising Up Angry. And today we're talking with Patrick Sturgis up in Milwaukee. Hello, Patrick.
Michael, Peter.
How are you?
Excuse me, is this Pete from Belmont and Racine?
Yes, that would be
Yeah, okay.
formerly of,
Formerly of Belmont and Racine.
yes.
Well, Pat, let's just start off with you telling us how you became involved in Rising Up Angry. What led you to that path?
Well, the path, I think we started on the path together. It Rising Up Angry emerged out of stuff that you and I had been doing and were doing. Some of it was because we were both living in Uptown. We had been involved in Join Community Union, which was an SDS project, and we left. We didn't leave Uptown exactly, but we left Join by request, and
Hi, everyone but me.
everyone but you. So Michael and I were living in Uptown, and certainly for both of us, because we were both from the East Coast and from uh, middle class waspish communities. So to find ourselves living in a community of hillbillies and Indians and Mexicans and blacks, primarily Appalachian white, was I'm not going to say a cultural shock because it wasn't a shock, but it was definitely a cultural awakening uh, for each of us in different ways, I'm sure. But it it opened up an entire world for me of music and food and friendships and ways of relating to people, which I felt very welcoming about. I felt very welcomed. I made friends that are still friends, and so that's where we emerged. That's the window that we emerged through, and so we were still in Uptown, but we were really not involved in Join. But we had really been talking a lot, traveling a lot, kind of talking a lot about the the difference between um, the difference between different ways of relating politically to white working class people. And we talked a lot. Michael had this thing about turn left off the interstate, and we traveled around, and we were always turning left off the interstate, discovering that that the world was really different from the way a lot of people around us were describing it and relating to it. That working class people were not like natively racist or anything like it, and that there was a lot of truth to the idea that working class people were used as tools to support uh, the economic status quo, not status quo, but to support an upper class. That that being realistic about the function of the police, being realistic about the function of landlords and the welfare system and healthcare system, that um, pointing all this stuff out to each other and to other people was a realistic way of fomenting change. So this was this was this was a lot of talk that we engaged in over as we consumed our organizing tools, which was the euphemism for. So I see Michael explaining that euphemism there.
No, I was just I was going to jump in and say
Yeah,
what I recall. I got a few things, but a number of us started working in Rogers Park area delivering groceries, and I
yeah,
think you were part of that crew, the Bud and Arts crew.
yeah,
And we was Jimmy Cartier, you and myself. We all, I'll confess, we all went to Lake Forest College. And we were, it was post joint community union where we had run Peggy Terry for vice president with Eldridge Cleaver in 68. And what were we going to do next? And we were going to
right.
start a newspaper that would uh, basically promote the revolution and make it
Yeah,
attractive and get to the young white kids so they could join with Latinos and blacks and others and make a big change in America. What do you remember about the young guys that we all got to know and became part of Rising Up Angry from Rogers Park when we were delivering groceries?
yeah. They they were a great group of guys. Some of them were there were a few assholes, that's for sure, and they stayed that way. Some of them, but there were a few key guys. One who is a late key guy, Tom Wood, died a few years ago, but he stayed connected to us in his own strange way. And of course,
And
Tom
his daughter
Gilchrist.
is playing in the, she plays
Yeah,
for Duke and she's in the,
granddaughter.
her
yeah,
granddaughter, yeah.
yeah.
Pat and I
His granddaughter.
met her when she was a little baby.
Yeah. And Tom Gilchrist, who has his own body of political views, but has stayed really well. He stayed a union guy for one thing. He was a union railroad man all his
And
working
he
life.
was a union steward too.
Right. Yeah. And very dedicated to that. And he maintains a very independent set of views, but he has always refused to be anybody's tool, which is something you really got to respect in a person, I think. And I love that guy. I talk to him once in a while. I think you do too, both of you. And they really, that group of guys really related, whether they were rejecting or accepting, they really related to the political message that we were bringing. And I think that they accepted our respect for where they were coming from. And I think that we part of the way that we respected where they were coming from, I think, is that their battle with the police, which was always ongoing, we worked to put in context that they were not being clamped down on because they were criminals. They were being clamped down on because they were working class kids, and it was in the interest of the powers of the city to keep them that way and to keep them from getting ahead, to keep them in control of the so-called justice system. And we respected them, their families, and we paid them $5 a day and all they could steal to eat out of the groceries.
That was 20% of what we were making.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember we did a lot of drive. They would be the helper, and
Yeah.
there were about three different trucks, and we'd all have one of these delivery trucks. We'd go to the grocery stores, we'd grab the boxes that were already set up, and then they would be the porch climbers. They would carry, they put the boxes on their shoulder, go up and down the stairs. We'd be on to the next place, and
Yeah.
both Tom Gilchrist and Woody were really involved in the early days. In fact,
Right. So there were 3 or 4 trucks. One of them was the Bud truck, because one of the guys who was part of that crew was Bud Paulin, who in the very initial days of Rising Up Angry and in the meetings, like the meeting in Ohio, I think that led to the formation of Angry, Bud was really involved. Various things caused him to drift away, but he and Junebug were very much a part of those early days, and Bud was an integral part of that Bud and Arts crew and of the kind of quasi organizing that we were doing of the C&D boys, the Clark and Devon guys who worked on the trucks with us.
We basically then did, it was like a vibe we had, you know, we were like rebellious, we were revolutionaries, we were about change, we identified with the Panthers, the Young
Right.
Lords, and we weren't going to take any shit from anybody. And they liked that.
They were
They
already
did. Yep.
they were already in that place. They just didn't know about the young lords. And
One of the things that happened was Gilchrist got beat up selling papers or pushed around at Lane Tech. And I don't know if you all remember, but Rising Up Prairie we all went to Lenny's, which was the greaser hangout over at
Yeah.
Lane, and we turned the place out. And you know, turned into a big fight, and we all escaped before the police came.
Yeah.
You were the first person to lay out a copy of the Rising Up Angry newspaper. What do you remember about that? It was in my apartment in a storefront in the 3200 block of Armitage.
Armitage. Yeah.
There's a fancy restaurant there now, I think, but it
Yeah.
was our fort. And
Yeah.
I remember we had a layout room or in the front, and we were doing the paper. What do you remember about that?
I I remember doing it. I think we might have even built a light table, but there was definitely a big layout table. And that was something that I had experience with. I worked on the college literary magazine and did layout for that and learned it there. And then at Join, we had the Firing Line newspaper, which I also laid out. And in those days, of course, layout work was very crude. It was completely non-digital. You know, you had adhesive type called Letraset and little rolls of stripes that you could use and all kinds of little sticky things that you used to make all the graphics in the paper. And that was something I knew how to do. It was one of the real reasons that Carl Davidson recruited me to edit New Left Notes. It wasn't my political depth.
what was New Left Notes?
New Left Notes was the voice of the national office of the SDS, and I was editor of that for a couple of years. And I was editor of that during the time that Rising Up Angry was evolving, because I started doing that when I was still part of Join, as I recall it, but then the students, so-called, were asked to leave Uptown and Join, and I kept that job at SDS. And we all kept talking about forming this other newspaper, which had no name yet until we saw that movie in Ohio.
The movie Wild in the Streets with the song, There's a New Sun Rising Up Angry in the Sky.
Revolution.
And as I recall, we on that same, there was this sort of gathering in Ohio while we talked about what kind of an organization to form. A lot of people talked. I think that Hamish Sinclair was there and Lawson was there. I've seen Bud in those pictures. But I think I remember you and I, unless I'm conflating this with some other trip, but I don't think so. I think I remember you and I, Michael, going to visit Oglesby, who was living in Ohio then. Do you remember that?
I do remember vaguely. I'm not sure if it was the same time or not, but Carl Oglesby was president of SDS for a time.
Yeah. And he was, I didn't know it, but he maybe even at that time, but around that time, he was married to a woman that I had gone out with when I was a Lake Forest College student. They didn't stay married, but she was interesting, a great woman. She was friends with Ava, the film director who made 13 and the 13th. I
DuVernay.
mean, yeah,
Ava DuVernay.
DuVernay. Ava what?
You're DuVernay.
Yeah,
I know it as DuVernay.
right, DuVernay. Anyway, they were close friends until my old friend died a few years ago. But I remember, and he was, as I remember, sort of lukewarm about what we were trying to do. But he had been kind of burned by SDS for sure. But in addition to our stop to see him, then we went. There was a movie playing in town in this theater, Wild on the Streets, and I recall going to it and kind of taking over the theater.
We did.
Uh,
We actually were drunk, and
yeah,
we were up in the projection booth. We were like
yeah,
rising up angry. We were incorrigible. We were out of control, young guys.
yeah, yeah.
And there was a cop there, kind of an Andy Fan type guy, but he didn't have any sway. It
Yeah,
was pretty. And then we came back the next day. We decided we were going to start the Rising Up Angry newspaper, but the purpose always was to build an organization.
right,
And that was, I recall Lenin saying, talked about the role of a newspaper in a pre-party situation. And that's what led me to think we needed a newspaper.
It might be helpful to run a little of the plot in this interview. That it was a time in the movie they were playing off the idea of someone had said recently at the time that everyone don't trust anyone over 30.
Yeah, so the young kids overthrow the old people, then the younger kids come on to
yeah,
overthrow them.
Well, they get elected president. The rock band gets elected president, and they order everyone over 30 into camps, holding camps. And
Like Trump wants to do.
well, it does have something to do with today. But even his mother, played by Shelley Winters, and I remember the camera moving in on her with her hands on the chain link fence, saying, "Let me out, let me out." And
It was basically a
yeah,
reactionary movie made by the same people who made the FBI series on TV and made a movie about Mao and one about Malcolm, I think, but they were kind of right wing. Patrick, I want
mhm,
to shift here a little bit. You
yeah.
you didn't stick around to be in town with Rising Up Angry. You, as a young theater guy, uh, well, when did you go to Milwaukee? Am I mixing things
That
up?
no, you're not mixing things up, but you are sort of racing ahead. Um,
Stop
I
me.
was involved. I was involved with Rising Up Angry for the certainly for the first several issues, but I had stayed too late at the dance. My Jimmy Cartier and Lisa and I had stayed at this Kickapoo Creek Rock Festival. We had stayed an extra couple of days because of because for various reasons, and and we missed a crucial meeting of the Central Committee of Rising Up Angry. So we were no longer on the Central Committee, although we still felt very committed to it and connected to it. But I would say I was not Central Committee material anyway. I really never liked selling papers. I really I liked rapping with guys in the park, um, laying out all the reasons that we need to do what we need to do, and analyzing what's going on. I didn't like selling papers. Also,
Which was a requirement of everybody.
it was a requirement, absolute requirement of everybody. And at one of the events that a bunch of angry people went to, including Tapas, I met Tapas's then girlfriend, Mary Elliott from Graver Park, and I sort of spirited her away from Tapas, and it didn't take us long for it to be really serious. And she got pregnant, and we got married. So in the very early stages of Angry, I had a young wife with a child on the way. So I started my work with Rising Up Angry began to be working at the Fritzie Engelstein Clinic rather than selling papers. And I certainly saw myself as a part of, or as very connected to Rising Up Angry, but was not part of the anything like the Central Committee work. And Angry was becoming, as were a lot of our organizations, and including Fritzie, we felt people felt very connected to Mao. Everybody had a little red book, and we got involved in criticism, self-criticism,
Yeah.
which in the end I don't think did a lot of us many favors, but that's where things were. So I stayed working at Fritzie, and then this theater company started in the same space, the same church as Fritzie Engelstein, the Bread and
Church of
Roses.
the Holy Covenant, Wilton and
Right.
Diversity.
Yeah. And I was, my wife left for a while. I stayed immersed in the work at the theater. We did some Bertolt Brecht work and a lot of Teatro dell'arte kind of things. Radical theater, not street theater. We did a great early production called Strike, about the Flint strike, which we took on the road and which eventually evolved short after I left. It evolved into a not exactly polished, but very accomplished, very, very powerful production of that play, which I think we wrote, but the company kept on writing it. A lot of people in the company remained, and a few more people joined. But Peter has shown me a film of that. Boy, they did a great job on that play. And then I moved to Milwaukee in '76.
I'm sorry, what was the name of the theater group?
Bread and Roses. Bread and Roses Theater.
Well, then when at the end of Rising Up Angry, I ended up with Katie Hogan and Stormy Brown, Diane Libman, my first wife, who took over the editorship of the Rising Up Angry paper. We all went on to start the Heartland Cafe in '76 as Angry came to an end in '75, basically. And the last issue, I think, was International Women's Day, '76, maybe. That would be March 8th. And you were an early server or waiter. We call them servers at the Heartland.
Yeah.
And I do have pictures of you in those early days, but then you went off to Milwaukee. What led you to Milwaukee, and how did your life then go forward? You're still a politically conscious guy. I don't know what work you've done in the political arena, who you root for, but tell us a little bit about what happened when you just left the heartland and Chicago and went to Milwaukee.
I left because I had made a final split with my wife, my first wife, Mary, for complicated. Well, it's always complicated, isn't it? But we couldn't sustain anything, and so we split. And I was really somewhat at loose ends. I moved into a basement apartment somewhere, and Peter told me that our old friends, Paul Sills and Jones Cullinan, and Jones was one of the people who had been integral to the making of The Murder of Fred Hampton and American Revolution 2, those two movies with Howard Hawks.
Yeah.
Great films, really great films. So Jones had been very involved in that. And Paul, I had done theater workshops with Paul in the very late '60s, because he lived in a neighborhood that we all frequented. Our lawyer lived there, and our karate teacher lived there, and Paul lived on that block.
We couldn't afford to live there now.
No, we could not. They couldn't. But Paul lived there, and I had always done a lot of theater, so he said I should come join his workshops, which I did, and I really loved the workshops. He moved the workshops to New York to do a full production, but I was just about to get married and said, I can't leave Chicago right now. So I stayed and did Bread and Roses. But when I learned from Peter that now Paul and Jones were starting this really crazy cultural center up in Milwaukee. They had bought a huge old barn of a building, were gutting it and creating a theater and a restaurant called Century Hall. So I went up, I visited for the weekend around the Christmas holidays of '76. It sounded great, so I just packed everything up, what little I had, left everything else stored in a trunk at Kuttner's house, and
Is it still
moved
there?
up to Milwaukee, where Century Hall was a going concern for a couple of years up there until it had to be sold for other reasons. But it was a very political, in a just a very loose kind of more countercultural sense of political, but very populist, pro-union, pro-feminist, all kinds of ways up at Century Hall. And I eventually ran the restaurant, the kitchen up there, and we did a couple of productions in the theater. And when that ended, and after about 6 months, even though I had a new girlfriend up in Milwaukee, I wanted to be close to my daughters again and moved back to Chicago for 3 years and did some more theater there before moving back to Milwaukee again to open this Beans and Barley. What I went to work for before it was a restaurant, when it was just a little store. When I had to leave Century Hall, I went to work for Beans and Barley as a baker, and eventually came back to Beans and Barley and became an owner there. And so I worked at Beans and Barley for 35 years, and it was a real, again, a countercultural cultural center. It was a hub. It about a month ago, it folded the tent finally after 53 years.
That was after you were gone from it. You had already
After I had
sold.
been gone for 13 years, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I take this back a little bit? I think it would be
Please do.
helpful. I think it would be helpful for people to know who Paul Sills was and why anyone would follow him. And everyone knows about Second City. So maybe you want to tell us who he was
Yeah,
and why you would be drawn to him.
yeah. And can I say, I think it's a really good thing that you both are doing the interview, because we all bring different recollections and focuses to those years. Paul Sills was a really important person in theater. He was one of the very important people in American theater, lesser known by some, but widely revered and regarded by a lot of actors and directors like Mike Nichols and Alan Arkin, Adam Arkin. A lot of people know him. Paul was one of the founders of Second City. He had started directing with the Compass Players at University of Chicago. I think, Peter, you probably know actually more detail about his early years, but that's where he started, and he made connections with a lot of people that he stayed connected to in theater for years and years. Severin Darden, all kinds of people, Mike Nichols, even he probably knew your dad, Michael, but there's no record of that as far as I know.
I don't know. My dad produced plays later in his life for people who were curious.
Yeah.
The only thing that I would add is that when Paul was growing up, his mother, actually before Paul was born, his mother was the godmother of the improvisation
Right.
movement.
Right.
And wrote books about it and had theories about it. And Paul continued that tradition.
Right. And one of Paul's daughters is continuing that work today. I don't know too much about it, but Paul's mother, Viola Spolin, is kind of known as the mother or godmother or doyen of improvisational theater in America. All the improvisation that comedy clubs and people do in Second City and US and SCTV, those are really all based on Viola's games that she used to train actors. So Paul, to learn that he was putting together a theater company in Milwaukee, and that I could possibly join it, it was pretty attractive for someone who really wanted to do theater. And then Jones was an attraction in her own right. All right, guys, what's going on?
Body politic.
I was just thinking
Oh,
back
yeah.
to reminded of Body Politic. The first Rising Up Angry was in the Body Politic Theater was when
Yeah.
they were building it, I think. The Shiflets were the family, and it was above Oxford's Pub on Lincoln Avenue. But that's where we
Yeah.
first when we first started putting out the paper. I remember some people, Carlos Cumpien showed up and got papers to take to the South Side, and and then we ended up having Rising Up Angry had several more offices, Lincoln Avenue and then on Belmont.
And then, of course, we couldn't go back to Oxford's Pub after Jimmy broke that guy's nose.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't remember that story. I remember breaking the owner's window of his car when the fire escape went down in the back and broke his window.
Ah, and how did the fire escape
Marty,
go down?
I was on it. It was one of those. It was that guy Marty. Anyhow, so Patrick, let me ask you. You spent a lot of years at Beans and Barley. It's a countercultural, cultural place, a meeting ground for progressive people in Milwaukee and probably beyond. Um, Anything you want to share from those years? And I want to get to where you at today and how you,
Yeah.
we're all in our 80s now,
Yep.
and but we're still active and moving around, and share whatever you want to share.
So, I my political beliefs, although I like to think they have evolved, they really have not changed at their core since I was in join. They've been fleshed out a lot. They relate to a lot more widespread focal points than they did. They're, as I said, more informed and educated, but they are really very much the same um, as they have been, as they were when I was a waiter at the Heartland, as they were when I was laying out the firing line and Rising Up Angry. But I have only peripherally been involved in political organizations here in Milwaukee. But Beans and Barley was in itself a political organization. And I'm going to describe it just when Beans and Barley, when it was announced a couple of months ago that Beans and Barley was going to close its doors, the Facebook pages began to fill up with, I would say, thousands of people writing to say that Beans and Barley was a formative place in their lives, that it was the best job that they had ever had, that they learned at Beans and Barley, they learned how employees should be regarded and treated, how customers should be treated, that everybody should work in a place like that, where that everybody who was ever going to be in a restaurant should work in a restaurant, so that they could learn what it was like to serve others. Beans and Barley became, and not because it was our intention or our business plan to make it this kind of a place, but Beans and Barley was a place where all of our employees, even if we had to fire them for some reason, were treated with respect. And we it was our basic principle in the kitchen, for instance, was if you come here to work in the kitchen and you've worked someplace and you had a favorite recipe there and you want to make it here, you can make it. If you make a recipe here and you love it, you can take it to the next place you go. None of our recipes are secrets, and we're cooking recipes from restaurants across the country and in fact around the world. So that was really that was my political work for those 30 years that I was at Beans and Barley. And here's another little couple of pieces. At Beans and Barley, I haven't been at Beans and Barley for 13 years. And about 4 years ago, I think Beans and Barley did start to take reservations at the dining room. But all the time that Patty and I were there, my wife Patty, were there, and I was the restaurant manager, the dining room manager and the restaurant manager, we never took reservations. In all those years, we did take one reservation. So Tom was the host at Beans and Barley. We did not take reservations, but he answered the phone one day, and somebody was asking for a reservation. And he got off the phone and came and said, "Pat, I took a reservation." And I asked him why. He said, "I took a reservation, but it's for Angela Davis, so I thought it would be okay."
I want to get one more thing about your work in restaurants and in theater. Put that together with the original concept that we learned from Mao and the Black Panthers of serving the people.
Yeah.
That's sort of what you've done with all of your work since
I think so. Yeah. I don't want it to sound smug, but that has been my political activism.
I'd like to know your advice to younger people or old people in these times of rising authoritarianism, and let's call it what it is, fascism.
Yeah.
And any advice you have for people out there, what they ought to do? And then I'm going to ask you one more after that.
Having been through the dissolution of SDS and then the dissolving of Rising Up Angry, and the fragmentation of the Black Panther Party, I certainly see sectarianism as something that is no friend to revolutionary change. I don't know what the answer to it is, because you can't be a revolutionary or be advocating revolutionary change unless you feel, pretty goddamn passionately and firmly about your beliefs and all the aspects of your beliefs. But where that leads into sectarianism, you begin to skate on very thin ice. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's one of our enemies, as of course is infiltration and agent provocateurs, which are around more than ever.
Okay, well, one more thing then. What do you hope for? Tell me, as an older guy now, probably close to 84.
Yeah.
What are you hoping for, Patrick?
I still hope for a more peaceful and just world. I can't say better than that. And I have to say that I yesterday returned from a several day visit to Montgomery, Alabama, to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum. And I have never been more impressed by anything than by the thoughtfulness and the thoroughness that whole campus has been put together, right down to the fact that, as my sister pointed out when we were looking at the plaque, it's even important that this memorial, which is the one to lynching, which is, it's mind-boggling and incredibly moving and serious and sobering, but it is called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And that's exactly what it tries to accomplish. It's, and I don't think you can hope for more than that. And it is staggering, the array of expressions of power that exist to prevent that from happening in the world. And that is what we're fighting. And so, in addition to my hope for that, it's my hope that we can overcome those forces.
Patrick Sturgis, member of Rising Up Angry, member of STS, member of Beans and Barley, server at the Heartland Cafe. You've done good in the world, and we're glad to be your pal.
Bread and roses.
And Bread and Roses, and Paul Sills, everybody you talked about.
I love you both. I love both you men.
Right on, brother.
Right on.
Power to the
Power
people.
to the people.
Power to the people.